We still have folks filing in, but I think for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So hello to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's webinar, Election Administration Spending in Local Election Jurisdictions. My name is Danny. I'm an election expert with the Elections Group, and I'll be your host today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Elections Group is an election administration consulting firm. We partner with state and local election officials to improve processes for election officials and voters alike. Before we begin today's webinar, the Q&A feature is open for audience members to ask questions. You should see that at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll have a dedicated Q&A section toward the end of the webinar. So if you don't see your question getting answered right away, don't worry about it. I promise we'll save some time to circle back to those. If you find your question is not answered on today's webinar, we encourage you to follow up via email at support@electionsgroup.com. I will remind you of that email again later in the presentation, so no need to jot it down. And now let's kick things off. So, have you ever wondered how much it costs to administer elections in the United States? How would one even go about answering that question with so many local election jurisdictions? Why is it important to systematically maintain data about the cost of elections? And how should policymakers, election officials, and other stakeholders consume and use that data? I am very fortunate to have three outstanding guests on screen to answer those questions and more for you today. So I'm going to hand the stage over to our amazing guests to introduce themselves. Martha, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
I do. Hi, I'm Dr. Martha Kropf. I'm a professor of political science and public policy at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Mary Jo?
Thanks, Martha. I'm Dr. Mary Jo McGowan. I'm also in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at UNC Charlotte, and really glad to be here. Zach?
And I'm Zach Mohr, formerly of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where I was Mary Jo and Martha's colleague. I was very lucky to be there. I'm now at the University of Kansas. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs and Administration.
Awesome. Thank you so much again to all of our guests, and thank you for those introductions. So let's dive right in. To kick us off, I would love to hand things back over to our guests and just sort of have them walk you through their research and their findings in their own words. Without further ado, I'm just going to hand the floor over to our guests.
All right, thanks, Danny. Really appreciate it. So we have our book coming out in a couple months. We're going to start talking about the data first. Thanks. So thanks. First of all, we want to talk about our data, and we really want to thank the MIT Election and Data Science Lab for the funding, and also for the survey of performance of American elections for all the data. So this data comes from all over the place, all over the United States, and we get the data mainly from the annual financial reports from the election jurisdictions. And as you can imagine, it was quite difficult to collect all those data over the few years that we've spent doing this project. We also have a lot of the data from the registered voters and ballots cast from the EAC's EVES survey. And then where we couldn't find those data, we supplemented from the state websites to gather the registered voters or ballot cast data.
Okay, so this is the final thing. This is the 30 or 40,000 foot view of what we found. It's a map, chloropleth map, and the darker green is where spending is highest. It probably is a bit of a surprise to non-election experts, although maybe some election experts would guess that spending is actually highest in Florida over our study period of 2008 to 2016. So that is kind of interesting in itself. There's also this really cool between state variation, a lot of variation here. So at the high end, you have Florida that's spending almost $20 per registered voter, California about 18, and New York and New Hampshire, a little over $17 per registered voter on average. At the low end, you have states like Maine and Vermont and Kentucky that they're spending like $2 or $3 per registered voter. So a huge difference. And I think that's one of the really important takeaways from our research, and that why I wanted to study the total cost of elections and the total costs, not just the cost of the election, but the total cost of elections administration throughout the entire year, was to show people the real variation between the states, but also within the states. So here is North Carolina, where we started our research, and this shows the within state variation. Like the Clarion-Cliff map, the bigger dots are where they spend more. Perhaps not surprisingly, the smallest dots are the biggest places. So Charlotte and Raleigh and Durham, they spend quite a bit less than the smaller jurisdictions where the average cost per voter is relatively high because of economies of scale. There's also all sorts of other reasons why some jurisdictions might have or want to spend more, but those are from place to place. So this is just kind of a within state look at North Carolina. Finally, this map shows the cost per registered voter in over the entire study period of 2008 to 2016 for all 48 states that we were able to collect. It's broken out by regions. So that top line there is the West. And you can see that spending actually came down over the study period in the West. Interestingly, in the South, there was a general trend upward in the amount spent. And we think that, a lot of this has to do with the different ways that voting is done and kind of different changing expectations in different regions of the country. And for me, this was probably the most interesting graph to just kind of see that costs are changing, and they're changing in kind of interesting ways from region to region.
So our book kind of completes with the so what. Does it really matter if we know how much jurisdictions are spending? For this, that's where we utilize the MIT Election Data and Science Lab survey. It's called the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, and it is conducted after elections, and it started in about 2008 with several questions that they have continued over time, all the way up to 2022, actually. But for this analysis, there's a couple of things that I want to tell you. First, so yes, we're using these survey questions, but when we decided to do this part of the analysis, we said, well, we don't want these data to go any further than Trump, because I think we all know that Trump had a big effect on confidence and other issues within the election. We thought that probably our findings were going to be more generalizable if we were looking at a time period where we didn't have some circumstances that were a little bit different. So that was another reason why we didn't go ahead on to 2020 for this particular analysis. Again, part of the problem, of course, is COVID really accelerated the expense of a lot of places, and a lot of places spent a lot more because of the CARES Act money. Some people had money, some of you all had some money from CTCL and Arnold Schwarzenegger's money. So we're only looking at a time period between 2008 and 2016. So the SPAE, the survey, asks, how confident are you that your ballot counted as you cast it? And it also asks questions like how common is several different kinds of fraud. So there were 2 different kinds of fraud that went through the whole time period. And of course, the confidence that their ballot counted as they cast it went through the entire time period as well. So we said, okay, so for every individual in the survey, well, first, I'm going to point this out. We used 9 states in this analysis. So the survey is done so that we can make conclusions about a state level policies. That's kind of one of the beauties of this survey. We use only 9 states because these are the states for which we had the most complete data. And also that they met sort of what we call a sort of a non-response analysis. We're kind of looking at how does whether or not we have the data correlate to size of the jurisdiction. And if we found that the states that we had data for were significantly different in size than the states that we didn't have data for, then we said, well, we think that that's going to be tough to say that that is representative or generalizable in terms of looking at the survey data. So then the second thing that we had to do is we had to say, okay, so we have all of these respondents. What counties so within the 9 states, everybody that's in the survey lives in a county, and we had the data on what county they lived in. So what we did was, well, and this is a kind of a fun difficulty that we had. You guys have crazy fiscal years. So the fiscal years really kind of messed with us, and we put our heads together and thought a lot about what to do, and decided that to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, we'll use a 2-year period of time within to take into account all of the fiscal years. So all of the fiscal years end sometime in this 2-year period and began at sometimes in this 2-year period. And then we said, okay, well, we have to adjust for inflation. So we did that as well. We use a 2-year period of time, and then we say, okay, per registered voter, how much is being spent? Now, we all know that some voter registration lists are better than others, and the EAC, some scholars would say it has its share of problems. We did some amount of checking on some of those data, and as Mary Jo mentioned, we also got some data from state websites on registered voters. So we feel pretty comfortable with this data. So we said, okay, Martha Kropf, she answered the survey. She lives in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and they spend X amount of money per registered voter. And we did that for all of the voters and over these 9 states. And what we find is that this is, well, statistically speaking, a kind of a complex relationship. What we find is that it creates what we will say, if you remember your math, a parabola. Well, and you can see a couple of parabolas right there. So for a little while, people believe more in fraud, as you can see from the first little figure right here. And then at about $50 per registered voter, they start to think that fraud is less and less confident. Similarly, with the confidence that your ballot counts, you start to be a little bit less confident, and then at a little under $50 a voter, you start to be more confident that your vote counted. So the bottom line, the big picture is that, and what we conclude is that the more you spend, the less likely that voters are going to believe that fraud exists in your jurisdiction, and the more likely they're going to be confident that their ballot counted. We think there's a few sort of causal mechanisms, as we might say, reasons why this happens. Better run elections, right? We've had earlier research in North Carolina where we found if they pay the election director more, we tend to see better outcomes, at least in terms of residual votes and in terms of voter turnout. So, and remember, residual votes is when you have the total number of ballots people that came out to vote, you subtract the total number of people who voted on a particular contest, and that difference is the number of residual votes. So we think that the conclusion that we feel really strongly about, though we weren't surprising to get good results on this because it's just such a big picture thing, is that more spending means more confidence and less belief in fraud. So I think with that, we're ready to take whatever questions.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much, guest. That was a really not only thorough and exciting presentation, but there was a lot of information in there. So I'm going to ask a few questions that I have prepared to sort of like parse that out, take a little more time on specific sections. And then I already see we're getting a bunch of really amazing questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to ask a few, and then I'm going to make sure we have a really good amount of time to dive into those audience questions too. So first, I think I just want to back up a little bit and ask a really big sort of broad question, which is this is really complex and interesting research. It's also very niche. So how did the three of you get involved in doing this kind of research? What brought you into this world?
Well, let me start by saying that this started over lunch one day. Our department at UNC Charlotte used to go to lunch all the time together. And I happened to be working on my book about institutions and the right to vote in America. And it seemed to me as I was doing this research, one thing we just really didn't know, honestly, was how much we were spending on elections, and in particularly, all these jurisdictions. So I went to, my local government guru who does cost accounting and all sorts of things that I would never in my life think that I would look at. And also my public policy scholar, public policy Ph.D. friend, Mary Jo. And I'm like, is there any information that you guys, but especially Zach, since he worked as a city manager at one point in his life, where can we find data on this? And is it possible? Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think so, said
I
Zach.
didn't say it
And
quite like that.
oh, you did. You said, I think you're just going to have a hard time finding anything like that. But then what happened, Zach?
We found the data a few months later. We found the data in North Carolina. So yeah, so that's right. That was really where the idea started, and we just kind of talked about it in our department, and started running analysis, and really thought it was really fascinating, some of the questions we could explore, and kind of some of the potentially policy things that we could contribute. So we were happy to keep doing.
Well,
Yeah.
and so we worked quite a bit at first with the North Carolina data, and then we asked Charles Stewart. We applied to his lab to get some funding, and they had at the time some new initiatives in election science grants, and we got that 2 years in a row, and we were able to hire graduate students. Mary
Yeah.
Jo, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that once you start looking at the data and thinking about this, because no one had really looked at it before, and we started coming up with all sorts of questions like, well, what does this mean? How does this impact elections? Well, why do they do that? We just kept coming up with more and more questions. And like Martha said, we started in North Carolina, but then it just sort of developed from there.
Right, then we were able to get other states and ask
Mhm.
the same questions.
Awesome. And that actually leads really great into this next question. So you touched on some of your biggest findings and takeaways, particularly you touched on sort of the cost of elections in different states, and you flagged it's interesting and maybe a little surprising to some of us that Florida ended up being sort of one of the the highest cost, I suppose, per capita in election spending. Are there any other big findings you'd want to draw out, especially for this audience where we're primarily election officials? Or if not big findings, anything that surprised you that you think would be of interest to us in your research?
We think the biggest findings are, what we presented. We sort of talked about what can we give you just kind of quickly. But we actually, it was kind of funny because we were having a little bit of a disagreement yesterday, because I'm constantly surprised at comparing within states how different the amount spent is. And keeping in mind that this is expenditures that we find from audited expense reports. I mean, I would think that they should be more like when you're thinking about it on a per registered voter basis. I mean, I do get, we did look at election director salaries in North Carolina, and we continue to, because Mary Jo's just pushed us to start a new project about, this is fun. She wants to know if what's the title of our new paper that we're working on?
Does Leslie Knope make more than me? So it's just another project comparing the salaries of election officials in the counties to other election officials in other counties.
And across other directors,
Yeah.
right? Because you guys
Yeah.
always say I'm the lowest. I mean, every time we talk to local election officials, right, Mary Jo, that
Yeah,
they're
they
like, well, we're the lowest paid
say
directors
we're
in
the
the whole
lowest paid.
county.
Yeah, so we're working on that now.
That is so awesome. Please, 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 we are definitely going to ask you guys to come back and do another webinar on that topic. I can already tell from the emoji reactions in the chat how excited the audience is. I know I got excited. Also, really a great title. So thank you. I want to focus on this, but now I want to ask questions about that too. So
Well,
we will.
just wait. She does have some, Mary Jo sent us some really cool graphs the other day that kind of showed that Leslie Knope would, I mean, if she was a county official, she would make more.
On average, Leslie would. One of the titles we were thinking of, does Leslie make or do I make more than Leslie? Nope.
Oh, that's fantastic. That was a great plug and teaser. I'm so excited. Okay, let me bring us back to the topic at hand for a second. So I've already.
Yeah. Can
Oh, sorry,
I
go
actually
ahead.
just say one more thing about the
Of
surprise
course.
thing? I mean, I think when we started the project, and we put this in the book, that we were kind of like, oh, I mean, how hard can it be? We'll just collect data from, I mean, North Carolina's got it. It shouldn't be that bad. 6 years later, we finally finished, right? So I think one of the things that we really learned is just how diverse and different the elections are done all over the country. That was amazing to me. I just figured everybody was like North Carolina, but silly me, learned a lot.
That yeah, I think for anybody who is like entered into this field, that's always sort of the one, like the first big surprising thing that comes to you. Especially for me, I used to work for the state of Virginia, and definitely as I sort of expanded my knowledge across the country, it's amazing and inspiring to see sort of the diversity of practices and how we still all sort of work towards this awesome shared goal. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. I want to move to those soon. But a lot of them are sort of about like policy concerns or like even just how to operationalize this data. So keeping in mind our audience is going to be a lot of local election officials, probably some state officials, and then of course some others. But for election officials, especially locals, what's important for them specifically to know about the cost of elections? And then also like how can they use the research that you've conducted? How can it be relevant or useful sort of in their day-to-day work?
I'm happy to start unless one of you two wants to start, but I feel like I'm jumping in a lot.
Go ahead, Mohr.
I was reading questions.
Pardon?
I was reading questions.
Well, okay. So I note that there is a big difference across jurisdictions. And, I actually had a really interesting conversation with TJ Pichet and Jennifer Mohr at one of the election science conferences about this. And they said, well, how would you explain, some Colorado jurisdictions use their marijuana money to throw a really good election. And I'm like, well, so, the fiscal ability of a jurisdiction it seems difficult for me to say that fiscal ability should determine how much they're able to spend. So this one election director has to get PVC pipe and duct tape to do things around the office, where this other director can do all the educational bits that she or he or they need to do, right? That there's just so much variation. I would think that fiscal ability or even recession, as Zach was talking about, in my mind, should not determine how much we are able to pay for elections. So I think turning to policy type solutions or things that you might be able to, I would love to see you leverage for is, we think, and we've spent some time thinking about policy things, but that the funding should be more stable and consistent. And I tend to think that it should be consistent across jurisdictions as well, or fairly so. Now Zach's going to shake his head, right? But it should be stable. So one thing that I think, state locals maybe could advocate for some sort of funding source, maybe from a state, that might be able to let them fill in when if a county can't fully maintain their elections. And I think that this big variation in the amount spent could be one piece of evidence that could be used in that, or the federal government as well, right? That there's so much, so, depending on what your partisanship is or what you feel the federal government's role versus the state's role should be, one or the other should be paying for elections, right? Yeah, so I began this project hoping I would give you guys leverage. I don't want someone to look at it and say, well, this guy's efficient and you're not. You're spending $2, he's spending $20. Well, for registered voter, I think the answer is $2 isn't enough. We can't say with these data how much is the right amount, though. That's the problem. We are only observing what is being spent. So I'll throw it to my colleagues if you have anything else you want to add.
No, this is good. You said that I would shake my head at you. Actually, I'm pretty much agreeing with you. I think that it was a bit of a surprise to me, and it's often a surprise when I talk to people about how after the Great Recession, like spending on elections went down for many years for most places. And that was not because there was less need for election funding. In fact, there's probably more need in most places. So yeah, we do have to figure out this stability funding issue. I think even among our team, we have spirited discussions about who should pay and how much they should pay. Yeah, hopefully this gives people leverage, and it gives people leverage to say, not only do we need more, but maybe we're even on the low end and we could use significantly more. So that's what.
Awesome. And Mary Jo, did you have anything on that question? If not, no problem.
No, I think they've pretty much covered it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the research that you've done, and I'm certain that our audience does as well, as folks who are either former and especially our current election officials. I think it's great that you're giving folks a tool in their tool belt. If nothing else, this is research that people can point to in whatever context is going to be helpful to make their operations run better, and say, hey, there are these really smart people who put a ton of effort into making sure we know how this operates, we know what the costs are, we know what things look like across the country. So on behalf of the audience and myself, let me say thank you for that. I want to make sure we have a ton of audience participation, and I'm really excited about it. So I want to make sure I'm going to shift our gears. Martha has a hard stop, needs to leave at 1 Eastern. I want to make sure we address the audience questions. So let me jump into those. I'm going to start with, our panelists have been really great and have been sort of on the side answering questions in the chat. I'm going to start with the open ones just to make sure everyone's question is addressed. So let's see. I see one. It looks like this is from Fred. Regarding cost per voter in Connecticut, I've looked at using a metric of cost per presidential vote. We use the same total budget per jurisdiction, but divide it by the number of people who voted in the last presidential election. That usually finds the bigger jurisdictions have higher costs than are reflected in your study because their turnout rates are significantly lower. So, okay, I'm sorry, that looks like more of a note than a question, but that is a good sort of. Yeah, absolutely, Zach.
Can I address this? Because we touch on this in the book, because we look at both cost per registered voter and cost per ballot cast. And there are times when you actually want to look at those costs per ballots cast. But yeah, that is a good point, and we see, and in the book, we talk about the ballots cast and how weirdly in the off presidential years, it looks like costs go way up but it's only because there's fewer ballots being cast. So yeah, it's kind of one of those interesting quirks in the data. And I should say there's other ways, other denominators that you could also look at that we should probably be exploring as well. So we will take any and all ideas. So yes,
Yeah,
it's
love it. Yeah, honestly, it's been kind of discussions with you all, with election officials, does this look right first? We talked to several North Carolina people. This is how much you're spending, right? No, yeah, that looks right. And because, well, we were, it's important that we get this as right as we can. Though we do say that this is a lower bound estimate, which we can sort of explain more because the data aren't perfect. Which we can talk about, but we feel comfortable with what we have. We had a really nice conversation with Judd Choate about if we should look at, in Colorado, they have the ACE data. And in Colorado, all the counties ask the states for compensation for running the state-based elections. And so they're telling them how much it costs for the election. And so we sort of realized that there's something that's a little bit different about these data. It's the cost that the office is open and doing election work. It's not necessarily the cost of an election, but the cost of the elections, right? You want to add a little bit to that, Zach? Because I feel like I said it not quite right, even though I've said it 100 times.
Right. That cost object, as the cost accountants would note, is very difficult. And yeah, Judd gave us and I've actually heard the phrase now used several times by election administrators. You all know what the difference is in costs. And so what we're looking at is the cost of running elections throughout the entire year or entire 2 years between elections. The presidential elections, so or national elections. So yeah, it is a difficult thing to really hone in on that cost object. And like Martha said, then you add in the complication of the differing fiscal years. That was also complicating. But
Yeah. Thanks, Zach and Martha. There's a couple questions in there too about like, do we account for this and do we account for that? All of that is encompassed in the whole election administration year in, year out practices. We're not just looking at just presidential or just midterm or just the election day. It's the year round, in and out, day to day practices of the election offices. So it's not just an election, it's election administration year in, year out.
it includes the election, but
Yeah, absolutely.
it's all the other things that go.
All of it.
Something I found really interesting when I was reviewing your research, and I think this is relevant to this point, but correct me if it's not, because you guys are the experts on this, not me. But when I was reading through, you sort of, when you discussed that framework of like a year, like, like the cost of elections versus an individual election, part of that is just because of like the nature of how they're administrated. So for example, like if you have voting systems that are still, up to date, like that don't need to be changed out, and maybe they've been around for a few years, those are, your voting systems are obviously very expensive. Where do those sort of factor into the cost, right? How do you figure out where those fit? Because you're not buying new voting machines for every single election that you administer. So like, at what point do those sort of get factored in? And correct me if I'm wrong or clarify, but my sense was sort of part of why you were looking for this appropriate time frame to define like the cost of elections was to try to like mitigate, like flatten out that, like, yeah, you're going to make sometimes, just like if you in an election office in your house, sometimes you have to make a big investment, a big purchase if your HVAC goes out. So you can't just look at like what you buy in a discrete little time frame. You've got to start to sort of figure out these long-term sets of costs that are bundled into this entity we call election administration. Great. Okay.
But I mean, it's a good point. And we did try to avoid, as Zach pointed out in an answer to Jenny Lovell, on the Q&A, that we were trying to avoid those big expenses, right? So that's another reason to start in 2008 and end in 2016. You know, there was some starting to be more modernization or, you know, updating of equipment around 2020, though probably should have happened sooner and probably did happen sooner in some jurisdictions. You know, there were occasional spikes. And they probably, we sort of did research on some of the spikes to sort of see, oh, look, they just renovate. There was a news story about how, or in the budget report, oh, look, there is a story about how X and Y county renovated their office or got a new office or set things up differently. So, I mean, we hope that looking over enough time period again, and this time period where we're trying to exclude the idea that, you know, voting equipment, new voting equipment. We hope that that sort of evens out. Of course, that's a potential weakness though, right? That those things do happen and they happen at different times when jurisdictions can afford them. But it goes to the bigger question, I guess, you know, when do some jurisdictions have more capacity than others to do stuff like that? And we can see that reflected in the data and in the differences in the data, perhaps. And so, yeah. Hey, Kathy, did you want me to, if Andy would give me the right to show it, I could show you our response rate chart. I pulled it up in the book and I could show you what the, if you want to see like percentages that we had from every county, or I'm not sure if you're interested. I have to do view one page here. Do you still want to see that?
Let me make sure,
It's
Andrew.
probably in the weeds.
Andrew,
Yeah, it is, but she asked about it in the live. Oops, now it disappeared. Oh, there
let
it
me make
is.
sure. Are you, Andrew? Give me a thumbs up. Are our guests able to screen share? I don't know if we gave you host permission. If not,
Oh, he says I have permission.
oh, okay, perfect.
If Kathy doesn't want to see it, I won't show it, but
Oh, no, I think people do. We saw a thumbs up come from the
okay,
chat.
okay, let me see. So where's share right here.
Great.
So
Yep.
this
Okay.
is, so let's see, can I make that bigger maybe? Yeah, I thought, oh, I know we have this. This is in the book.
In Martha, in the bottom right of your screen, if you want to make it bigger, do you see the little
I do, and I can. How's that? Better?
Yeah, I think that's a lot better for me at least.
So this is, you know, really important to us to make sure that we have this. So and we did this and the non-response analysis to kind of see which states that we should include in our confidence examination. So I'll go up a little bit. If anybody wants to see something in particular, stop me.
And if you want to see something in particular, feel free to use that Q&A function if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yeah, we'll see those. So
is there any particular state that anybody is interested in or that I can?
I have
Kathy was primarily interested in the gray states, Wisconsin.
Yeah, she had
and-
mentioned
yeah.
that too, yeah. And you explained why Michigan and Wisconsin are not included in the analysis.
great.
So you guys can look, if you want the answer to that, that's in the Q&A.
And we can share out also, we'll send a follow-up email. Everyone who's on this webinar will receive that because you registered. So we can include any sort of resources that the guests are willing to share or are interested in sharing. You guys will also, of course, get a link to this recording if you want to go back and rewatch or if you joined a little bit late. So we'll make sure all of this information is shared with anybody on the call. Great. I still want to go through. So there were a handful of audience questions that we were able to answer on the side, but I think it's worth maybe revisiting them just so we can say them out loud for the whole webinar group. So one of the questions I see from, okay, so we kind of addressed this. Bob said, is there a better data point than cost per voter? The cost per voter is significantly impacted by the number of voters in a jurisdiction. Mary Jo, I saw you responded to Bob in the chat. Maybe if you just want to give a few words on that.
Yeah, so Bob's question was about that he's got a county with a whole bunch of voters, and then he's got a county and the cost per voter is low, but then he had a special election where the cost per voter is high. But because we're looking at the election administration across the year, it's going to encompass all of that. So you're going to have those elections included in the expenditures.
And we're also
Yes.
looking at registered, for most of the things that
Mhm.
we're looking at, like confidence, we're looking at the cost per registered voter in the jurisdiction too. So that should take that into account.
Can I just say
Yeah,
please.
something a little bit more general about the broader point here is that you know, when Bob is talking about the cost per voter for the entire county, that cost comes way down because you have a lot on average. The average cost per voter is low because you have so many people in this jurisdiction. But when you are talking about a special election, you're going to have a lot fewer voters, and so it probably shocks the you know jurisdiction that you're running the special election for, that their cost per voter is so much more than the cost per voter in the general election. So I think probably for the election administrators, you know, to be able to explain that, you know, we kind of have these fixed, or maybe not completely fixed, but direct costs, and those costs get divided out really big in the general elections. But in the smaller special elections, you're just not going to have the same number of people. So if you're charging that back to them on a per person basis, it may be a bit shocking to the small special election jurisdictions when they get that bill. But that's okay, because that's actually what we should expect with those sorts of cost dynamics.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a really helpful like explanation and clarification. I see, so Martha, I see you flagged a couple questions that I'm gonna get to in a moment. I also saw another question just came in from Jenny from the chat. I think this is just a clarification question. Does percent collected 2008 to 2016 mean percent of jurisdictions each year over the time period? That was the question from Jenny.
Go in the non-response analysis.
Yeah,
That's what it means. That's what it means, because there may be some jurisdictions where we have only partially collected, so the denominator is jurisdiction years. So yes.
Great. I just have a few more wrap-up questions before we sort of start to get to the end, put a few final points on this and conclude. But please feel free to keep adding questions to the chat. We're happy to answer those until basically 1 Eastern. One of the questions I had for you all is, when I was reviewing your research, you had mentioned these terms shared resources and shared costs. So can you tell us more about shared resources and shared cost and why those terms are relevant to determining the cost of elections?
So I flagged that, Zach, because you know, having had the experience of working, you know, in local government, you especially have really smart insights about the possibility of there being resources that are shared across, you know, that it's not just an election server, computer server, but it's also HR's computer server or Leslie Knope's computer server, right? Do you want to talk about that, Sam?
Because it has to be
sure. Yeah.
because it has to be secure. So it's not unheard of, or it's probably fairly common in small jurisdictions that, you know, the election office shares part of the cost and of the sheriff's election server, for example. You know, in the larger jurisdictions, they may have their own servers, and so that cost is included perhaps in the large jurisdictions, where in the smaller jurisdictions, because we can't tease that out from the annual financial reports, we may not see it in there. So yeah, shared costs are definitely important, and something that we try to address. But ultimately, we are going to not be able to maybe get all of those shared costs if we don't know about them. So yeah. But
It's just an
they're
important proviso. I mean, we stand behind our data, but we want to be, very open about what these data are and what they aren't. And so we in the book will say that this is a sort of, it's possible that these are lower bound estimates, that it actually may cost a little more if you happen to be one of those counties that shares a server with HR or Parks and Rec or Public Works. So this is just important to know.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I hope for those of you in the audience who've attended, multiple of the webinars in this series, we've brought in different researchers. And what I think is really excellent about these conversations is there's an opportunity to not only like sort of put the research out there and say, here's what we found, but to give that context sort of verbally where people can ask these questions and understand it. Because I think that just makes the your tool belt, if I stick with that metaphor, like a little sharper, a little stronger. If somebody comes back with a qualifying question and says, well, like, oh, what about this shared server cost? And you say, yeah, I know how they accounted for that. I understand like the relationship that has to the research. So thank you so much for giving us an explanation of that.
I actually think Richard Leadbeater, sorry, Richard, had a really neat, a good point that I hadn't thought about, was that hopefully you can leverage these data to say to your, folks in your county, no, we can't do that wild idea of yours. That's a good point.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Richard. Great. So I think we've gotten through most of the chat questions. If I have missed something, please feel free to re-up it. Let me take a look.
Can I address Richard had another point about the segmenting of cost by method, mail, Dropbox, in-person, and in-person election day.
Yeah,
and I think that's another one of those kind of big policy questions that we would like to be able to answer. But because our data are aggregate, we're not able to break that out. But I think that even some case studies of those kind of a couple of jurisdictions and how much those costs in different jurisdictions, to me, that seems like it would be helpful. I don't know if that would be helpful to the election community that's on here right now, but to me, that seems like something that might be useful. So if you think that would be helpful, give me a thumbs up or something. Send me an email. Send me an email.
Emoji me. Oh.
You got a thumbs up, Jack.
Yeah.
Good,
There you
good.
go.
Somebody
Two, three.
Oh, thank you
Yeah, all right,
guys.
good. Thank you all.
Great. That was actually a really good segue to the final personal question I had for this team, which is, and you touched on it a little bit. You gave us that teaser about the Leslie Knope research that I know we're all really excited about. But I'm also curious, you spent a lot of time looking into these questions and trying to answer them the best you could, and sort of giving us those qualifiers. What kind of future research would you like to see that could build on this work? Or, even if it doesn't exactly build on this, just sort of in the same realm, adjacent to it, that you'd love to see?
Well, I'd love to see the different costs by voting type. I think that would be really, really interesting and valuable.
Well, so Zach has also had a graduate student this summer collecting data on the more recent of these reports that we were able to get. And so one thing that you've said, Zach, I think is interesting, to be comparing these sort of basic costs to pandemic costs. And it'll be interesting to really get some more. I mean, it seems obvious, right, that it probably cost a lot more during the pandemic to run the election, but why we do this kind of science is sometimes the obvious isn't right. So like early voting, gosh, that should of course that's going to increase voter turnout. Well, you know, in study after study, it's not clear that early voting does increase voter turnout, while mail voting, which is a different sort of arguably kind of early voting, does. So, you know, sometimes our job is to look at the non-obvious things. So, you know, moving forward, but so, okay, so well, let me tell you, let me, if I can, share something we were talking about yesterday. And that's how, you know, these data, you know, I think you see the value in them, but these data aren't always going to be available or easily available. And so the question is how, you know, we could probably keep collecting a lot of these, but it did take a lot of time and effort to collect these. How do we keep something like this sustainable so that you all and us could use the data? Like we were just trying to figure out, how do we keep getting this kind of information? I mean, I don't see putting it on like the election, the Eve survey, right? I don't think that makes a lot of sense, but how do we keep this sustainable? It's a question I'm just really curious about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't have an answer offhand, but yeah, I would love, I mean, I'm sure there are folks in our audience who at least have thoughts about that. So you know what, you post that question, Martha, if anybody has a thought on how to do that, not only could you throw that in the chat or the Q&A, but also feel free to email us at support at electionsgroup.com after this if you have ideas, and we'll make sure those get to Martha, Mary Jo, and Zach. That's awesome. Well,
You know what? I want to. Anthony Gutierrez had a really relevant question. He's like, "How can you adjust for the politics in one county versus another?" And we were trying to really avoid the politics, the big political questions here, right? Because we didn't want this to turn into a polemic, you know, like a tool that somebody could use for polarization. Oh, well, you're disenfranchising the voters. We wanted this to be the facts so you could use it. And I feel very strongly about that. But he's like, how do you adjust for the political factor? One county exec council administration gives their election office full funding. Then after an election, an incoming administration chooses to gut their budget significantly. So I think where it becomes relevant is, so we don't look at politics, as Zach said, but I think you would use this to leverage, or at least to make an argument for why they shouldn't cut your budget. Like you're already low on the cost per registered voter, or, you know, there's all kinds of arguments, you know, what goes, I mean, either it's a new administration, like the thing that worries me in some states is, you know, the county commissions, and we found some evidence of this in North Carolina. County commissions are political bodies. And if they don't like you, or they don't, you know, or if they think that you're spending too much money, they'll cut your budget. And they need to understand that we can't have democracy without elections and election officials. And so I'm hoping that you can use this data to leverage the right amount of money.
I think that's such an awesome point to at least conclude the Q&A on. With that, it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. I know our panelists have a hard stop at 1. I want to respect that. So I think what I'd like to do is just with the last few minutes, I'd like to give each of you on the panel an opportunity to just take a few minutes and make a final remark and close us out. So Martha, if you want to go ahead first.
Well, I mean, I think the bigger point is that this book isn't going to tell you this voter or that voter is disenfranchised by the amount of money spent. This book is going to, I hope, give you some tools. You know, spending more money increases confidence. You know, that recession can hurt us, but we still have to run an election. So you guys need to think about that, or state, hey, let's put together a fund, or, you know, federal government, hey, put together a fund to keep these big differences from happening across election fields. I wanted these data to be useful to you. I mean, so often we kind of play with data and it's fun and we have these results that we keep to ourselves, you know, and the only other people that read them are other political scientists. And this is really important for you guys to know that we want it to be useful for you, and I hope it is.
Great. Thank you.
Mary Jo?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with this. And I would also say that this is really a first look at this. And I mean, your questions and your comments just help us build it better later going forward. So, you know, definitely keep them coming. I mean, the more questions we have, the better off we'll be. Well, we can make it better, and we can look at different things like the different kinds of administration and so forth. And, you know, I love looking at the policy process here. And I also think it would be really interesting to find out what you think about it. Like, where are you saving money? Where are you spending money that we might not even be thinking about?
Great. Thank you so
Right.
much. And then Zach, yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a whole lot more to add. Just thank you to everyone for being on the call, and thank you for having us, and thank you to my wonderful co-authors.
Well, I
Thank
want to
you,
thank you as
Zach.
well, guys. But also thank you, you know, I mean, people that have helped us or given us
Yes,
information or
yes,
taken their
we have
time to us.
we have really benefited from this community. So yes, we want
Well,
to get back.
absolutely true. And I'll just give a shout out to Michael Dickerson and Kristen Mavromatis at Mecklenburg County, because they've been really helpful. And I met their new assistant or their new person in the office, who's Carol Williams, at a recent conference, and love them.
Yeah, I
You
think
guys are helpful.
that's been one of the great things, is meeting the election administrators at some of the conferences and stuff, and just hearing the stories and thinking, oh, you know, maybe we should think about that for our work. So it's super helpful.
Definitely.
Thank you all so much. I'm obviously biased, but I think the election administration community is absolutely awesome. They're the best people, and we appreciate so much folks like you who are using your talents and your time to help us. So thank you so much. Real quick, before I sort of wrap us up, though, can you guys remind everybody the book title and, you know, where they can get the book? I want to make sure everybody knows, because I think people are really interested.
Okay, it's called A Republic, If You Can Afford It. How much does it cost to administer elections? Zach is not optimistic, but you know, our guy
I'm
told us
still
probably
hopeful.
October.
It's
They're
in copy
editing.
editing.
They're copy editing today, so it'll be a little while. But don't you worry, we'll be talking about it a lot. I hope. And so if you have any questions about us, let us know, and we'd be happy to
Shortly,
help.
I think shortly after the election, it should be out. That's fingers crossed. I
Okay, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Okay.
Great. Thank you all so much. We will
Thank
also,
you.
after we get the book title out to everybody in that follow-up email, so that you all know to look out for it, hopefully shortly after the election. That's going to conclude our webinar. So let me say thank you one more time to our amazing guests, Martha, Zach, and Mary Jo. And thank you to everyone who joined us for today's conversation. The participation from the audience was great, and you're what make these conversations really rich and inviting and exciting for all of us. Final notes, a video copy of this webinar will be posted online on the election group's website. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive a link to that video, so just look out for it in your email. And as always, we encourage you to visit our website, electionsgroup.com. There you'll find a ton of free resources and tools to assist election officials as they prepare for Election Day, which is way too soon, and beyond. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.